The coffee had gone cold, untouched, while the front door opened behind me without warning. Morning light spilled across the kitchen floor, and I remember the hum of the refrigerator sounding too loud for a house that had just lost its heartbeat. My hands were shaking, not from grief alone, but from the sudden awareness that something was wrong. If you're watching this and you've ever felt blindsided by people you trusted, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this don't happen in isolation. I stood there in my own home, still wearing yesterday's clothes, realizing the silence had shifted. The air felt heavier, sharper, as if the walls themselves were listening. I had buried my husband only days before, and already the life we built together was being measured, assessed, claimed. I didn't know it yet, but that quiet moment in the kitchen was the first crack. That was when everything I thought was secure began to unravel. The coffee mug was still on the counter, half full, gone cold, waiting for a man who would never lift it again. That was how the morning found me. My name is Margaret Cole. I am 61 years old. My husband, Daniel, died 3 days earlier, and the house had not learned how to breathe without him. Grief made time feel thick. Every room held his shape. I moved slowly, careful, as if sudden motion might shatter what little balance I had left. I believed those first days were meant for silence and mercy. I was wrong. Before I could gather myself, his children arrived. Not quietly, not gently. They came with purpose, stepping through the front door like people who had already decided where they belonged. I stood there in yesterday's sweater, still learning how to be a widow, while they moved past me, eyes scanning walls, shelves, corners. Their attention never lingered on me. I felt the shift immediately. Their presence changed the air. This was not a visit of comfort. It was an inspection. I realized then how alone I was in my own home, how easily grief made me invisible. Something important was being taken from me, and it was only just beginning. I had no idea yet how that erasure was going to be. I watched them walk through the house as if it were a checklist, not a life. Every room carried years of quiet routines, shared jokes, small arguments that ended in forgiveness. Daniel and I built this place one ordinary day at a time. I cooked here. I cleaned here. I sat awake through long nights worrying about bills, illnesses, futures that never seemed guaranteed. Yet as his children moved through those rooms, none of that history seemed to register. Their faces stayed composed, distant, practical. They did not linger on photographs or ask about memories. Their attention went straight to doors, cabinets, paperwork. In their eyes, the house was not a home. It was an asset, standing there. I felt myself shrinking, like a footnote in someone else's story. That was when it became clear I was not being seen as Daniel's wife. I was being treated like a temporary occupant who had overstayed her welcome. They spoke in careful, reasonable terms about what was fair, what was written, what was proper. I listened while my marriage was quietly reduced to documents. There was mention of a life insurance policy, presented as if it were kindness. A neat number meant to close the conversation. I measured it against the years I gave up, the job I left, the stability I sacrificed to keep our life moving. The math did not work, and they knew it. Then came the final detail, delivered without hesitation. The remaining medical bills would fall to me. In that moment, grief hardened into something colder. I was losing my home, my standing, and now my financial ground. I could feel a choice forming ahead of me, one that promised no mercy either way, and I sensed days would force me to decide how to survive alone. I met with an attorney in a quiet office that smelled like paper and old coffee. The noise of the house faded there, leaving only facts. I learned that challenging the will was possible, but possible did not mean survivable. Fighting meant months, maybe years, of hearings, documents, and waiting. It meant legal fees stacking higher than my savings and stress settling into my bones. I imagined myself in court, watched by strangers who would not see grief, only suspicion. I could already feel the label forming, the older woman accused of wanting more than she deserved. That thought alone made my chest tighten. I had barely slept since Daniel died, and my body carried that truth. My hands shook. My thoughts moved slowly. I was tired in a way rest could not fix. If I fought, I might win something eventually, but I would lose my peace, my health, and whatever dignity I still had. If I walked away, I would lose my home, my security, and the life I had known. Either path led to loss. That was the cruelty of it. I sat with that weight for a long time. Then something shifted. I realized I did not have the strength for open war, but I still had awareness. Choosing not to fight did not mean I agreed. It meant I was conserving what little energy remained. So I decided to let them believe I was done. I chose stillness, not because I was defeated, but because watching quietly felt safer than screaming into a system that had already decided who I was. Silence became my shelter, a pause before movement, a place to breathe, observe, and prepare myself for whatever came next without revealing how much I was still thinking and learning where my footing remained. I learned quickly that grief makes people look smaller than they are. When you stop arguing, stop pleading, others assume you have given up. I let that assumption live. I stopped correcting them. I stopped explaining myself. Outwardly, I became quiet. Daniel's children responded to that silence immediately. Their tone softened, their manners sharpened, but their movement sped up. Papers arrived faster, deadlines felt tighter. They checked in often, not to ask how I was, but to make sure I was still complying. Watching them, I felt a faint unease. People who are winning do not rush like that. So I stayed still. I nodded. I listened. I let them believe the story they preferred, that grief had drained me of fight and clarity. In truth, I was paying closer attention than ever before. That evening, the house was empty again. The quiet pressed in, heavy but familiar. I walked through the room slowly, touching the back of a chair, the edge of a doorway, letting memories surface and pass. Beneath the sadness, something else stirred. Awareness. Silence sharpened my senses. I noticed details I had overlooked before. Things Daniel touched often, places he lingered. The stillness was no longer numb. It was alert. I did not yet know what I was searching for. Only that instinct was beginning to speak. And for the first time since everything began unraveling, I trusted myself enough to listen. Without noise, I sensed a direction forming quietly, steady, patient, and unexpectedly mine alone. I kept the small key in my pocket, feeling its weight every time I moved. I tried it in every lock in the house, each failure feeding the fear that I was reaching for meaning that did not exist. Cabinets, drawers, old trunks, nothing. Doubt crept in, whispering that grief was making me desperate. Later, while sorting through Daniel's wallet, something unfamiliar caught my eye. A thin card from a local bank, not one we used together. On the back was a number written in his careful hand. That stopped me. I took out the key again, turning it slowly, and the thought settled with quiet certainty. A safety deposit box. My pulse quickened, followed immediately by hesitation. What if there was nothing? What if opening it only deepened the loss? I stood there for a long moment, arguing with myself, afraid of hope and equally afraid of ignoring it. Finally, instinct won. I grabbed my coat and left without telling anyone. The bank was cool and hushed, the kind of place where footsteps echo and time slows. Metal and paper filled the air. Being led down a narrow hallway felt unreal, like stepping into a hidden chapter of my life. When the box was placed in front of me, my hands trembled. I rested them on the lid, breathing slowly, knowing that whatever waited inside would change something. I did not open it yet. I sat there, balanced between fear and truth, moments away from answers Daniel had trusted me to find. The silence around me felt deliberate, as if the room itself was holding its breath, urging me forward while warning me nothing would ever be the same. I lifted the lid slowly, half expecting the box to be empty, or worse, meaningless. Instead, it felt heavy, solid, deliberate. Inside were folders stacked with care, papers aligned as if Daniel had planned this moment. My breath caught as I took the first one out. Bank statements sat on top, accounts I had never seen, balances that made my hands shake. There was more than enough to keep me housed, fed, safe. Relief hit hard, followed instantly by grief. He had known. While I worried over pennies and sacrifices, he'd been quietly guarding a future for me. Beneath the statements were printed emails and transaction records. As I read, my stomach tightened. Patterns emerged, transfers that made no sense, conversations that carried urgency and secrecy. I understood then that his children had not simply appeared after his death. They had been circling long before it. Betrayal was no longer a feeling, it was documented. Another folder held a will dated months after the one they showed me. This one named me fully, clearly. I had to steady myself against the table. Daniel had not forgotten me. He had anticipated what might happen and prepared accordingly. The silence I mistook for absence was strategy. I sat there for a long time, letting the truth settle. I was not powerless. I was not trapped. Everything they thought they had already taken was standing on fragile ground. For the first time since the funeral, my fear loosened its grip. At the bottom of the box, beneath the documents and proofs, lay a single envelope. My name was written on it in Daniel's handwriting. Seeing it shifted something deeper than money or justice. Whatever was inside, it was meant only for me, and I knew it would explain why he had trusted silence to protect me when words could not, and why love sometimes hides in preparation, patience, and unseen choices made quietly for survival, dignity, and the future of someone he could no longer stand beside in the light, but never truly left alone in the dark moments ahead of me. I held the envelope for a long time before opening it. Seeing Daniel's handwriting made my chest ache in a way nothing else had. Part of me feared the letter would reopen wounds I was barely managing. Another part needed to understand why he had kept so much hidden. As I read, the confusion I carried began to soften. Daniel had known his children were watching, waiting. He understood that honesty, spoken too early, could put me in danger. His silence was not distance, it was shielding. He had chosen patience over reassurance, planning over comfort, because he believed that was the only way to keep me safe when he no longer could. The letter explained how he moved money quietly, how he changed documents late at night when his strength was fading. He anticipated their greed and turned it against them. The properties they were so eager to claim were burdened with debt, by design, traps meant to collapse under the weight of their own choices. Reading that, something inside me settled. I stopped questioning whether I had been excluded. I saw that I had been trusted. Daniel believed I would know when to act and when to wait. That trust steadied me more than any promise ever could. By the time I folded the letter and placed it back in the box, my grief had changed shape. It was still there, but it no longer felt lonely. I was ready now, not angry, not rushed, just clear. I accepted the dinner invitation without hesitation. The table was set carefully, expensive dishes arranged to suggest family and closure. Smiles were offered easily, voices light, as if the hard parts were already behind us. They spoke about plans, renovations, sales, futures they believed were settled. I listened, nodding, letting them fill the space. I noticed how quickly they spoke, how often they checked my face. Confidence usually moves slower. Their warmth felt rehearsed, layered over something tighter beneath. I stayed quiet, sipping water, grounded in what I now knew and what they did not. At one point, I mentioned the small key I had found, almost casually, and how strange it was to uncover things you never expect. The shift was immediate. A pause too long, a hand stilling mid-motion. The room cooled in a way only fear can manage. They recovered quickly, but not completely. From then on, every gesture confirmed it. Questions disguised as concern. Laughter arriving a second too late. They were measuring me, recalculating, and I realized they no longer believed I was harmless. I left that night calm, almost grateful. Nothing had been said, yet everything had changed. I did not need to challenge them across that table. Their unease told me enough. Whatever came next would not happen in living rooms or over dinner. It would happen somewhere formal, structured, and final. And for the first time, I knew I would walk into that room steady, prepared, and unafraid of what the truth. I arrived at the law office early, the kind of place where voices stay low and decisions linger. Sitting at the table, I felt steady. Grief was no longer steering me. Preparation was. Documents were laid out one by one, and with each page, the room changed. Financial records surfaced first, outlining money moved quietly, debts hidden carefully, and obligations tied to properties they believed were prizes. I watched confidence drain from their posture as reality replaced assumption. More evidence followed, revealing choices they made while Daniel was still alive, patterns of misuse, risky behavior, and shortcuts taken in secret. I did not need to raise my voice. The truth carried its own weight, settling heavily between us. What struck me most was how quickly certainty collapsed. They had arrived expecting compliance, perhaps negotiation. Instead, they faced consequences already set in motion. Every attempt to interrupt or deflect faded as facts stacked neatly, impossible to argue with. Then came the final documents, an offer, clear and simple. They could accept the inheritance they had demanded, exactly as structured, with every loan and liability attached, or they could walk away and face what the evidence pointed toward beyond this room. Fear has a sound. It is not loud. It is the quiet that follows when options disappear. I felt no triumph watching them sign, only relief. The signatures went down slowly, hands unsteady, sealing choices they could no longer undo. There was a strange stillness as chairs scraped back and papers were gathered. No one looked at me anymore. They were busy calculating damage. I walked out into daylight feeling lighter, not victorious, just finished, aware that silence and patience had rewritten an ending they thought was fixed forever and far beyond their reach, now entirely. When it was done, I gathered my things and stood. The balance had shifted completely. What happened next would not involve me. Consequences would unfold in their time, carried by systems they once thought they controlled. I left knowing the truth had done its work, and that calm preparation had succeeded where anger never could. Time moved on without ceremony. Within months, the properties they claimed were gone. Refinancing failed, payments lapsed, and lenders stepped in. What looked like inheritance revealed itself as obligation, and the houses became burdens no one could carry. Their professional lives followed the same pattern. Investigations began. Licenses were questioned. Clients disappeared. Reputation, once assumed permanent, proved fragile when trust collapsed. Friends grew distant. Family gatherings thinned. The certainty they carried into that law office unraveled quietly, day by day. I heard these things indirectly, through paperwork and secondhand updates. I did not call. I did not respond. Stepping back was deliberate. Their consequences were not mine to manage, and I had no desire to witness their unraveling up close. What surprised me was my calm. While their world narrowed, mine widened. Silence returned to my days, no longer heavy, but restful. Justice did not arrive loudly. It unfolded through systems already in motion, shaped by choices they made long before I stepped aside. As I watched from a distance, I understood that walking away was not avoidance, but the final boundary that allowed peace to grow without being pulled back into their damage and reclaim the life Daniel wanted. I moved to a small coastal town where mornings arrived softly and no one knew my history. The house I chose was modest, with light-filled rooms and a yard just large enough for a garden. For the first time in years, space felt like safety, not something that could be taken away. My days became simple. Coffee on the porch, long walks near the water, planting herbs and watching them grow without being rushed. No unexpected knocks, no deadlines hanging over my head. The silence I once feared now felt like permission to rest. I noticed changes inside myself. My shoulders relaxed. Sleep came easier. I stopped replaying old conversations and stopped preparing defenses that were no longer needed. Freedom, I learned, is not loud. It is steady. Daniel did not leave me houses or power. He left me the chance to live without fear. That became my real inheritance. The life I lost was larger, heavier, and filled with tension I had normalized. This one was smaller, lighter, and finally mine. One quiet morning in my kitchen, I realized winning does not look like victory at all. Sometimes it looks like peace, and that truth stayed with me there. I learned that silence is often mistaken for weakness, especially when grief makes your voice softer. But silence can also be listening, watching, choosing not to react until clarity arrives. That lesson changed how I see strength. If you are hearing this and feel overlooked, dismissed, or trapped by people who speak louder than you, I want you to know something. You are not invisible. You are not powerless. Awareness is a form of strength that does not need permission to exist. There were moments when patience felt unbearable, when staying quiet felt like disappearing. But patience gave me space to see clearly, to trust myself, and to move when the time was right. Strength does not always demand confrontation. Sometimes it asks for restraint. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Sharing it has reminded me how many quiet battles people carry alone. If any part of this resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. I read them all. And if you want more stories about quiet strength and choosing yourself, stay connected here. Your story is still unfolding, and I am grateful you listened today with kindness always.